Spain would be the premier European power for much of the 16th and 17th centuries. Much of its success was owed to its professional infantry, the much-vaunted Tercios, nicknamed by some the Invincibles or the Immortals. What was a tercio? The tercio was a large block of infantry that comprised a mixture of pikemen, arquebusiers, musketeers, and swordsmen. Later variations generally consisted only of musketeers and pikemen. The name came from the original mix of troops within the formation: 1/3 pikemen, 1/3 arquebusiers, and 1/3 swordsmen. The pikemen protected the arquebusiers from cavalry. The swordsmen protected the pikemen from other infantry, and the arquebusiers provided firepower. As time went on, the swordsmen were gradually phased out in favor of more pikemen and gunpowder weapons. They were an awesome sight on the battlefield. The center was a square of pikemen, and there were formations of arquebusiers at each corner. Observers said it looked like a moving castle with 4 towers. The combination of pikemen and muskets, arquebuses, was known as pike and shot. The tactics were to dominate European battlefields for much of the 16th and 17th centuries. Other countries would emulate the Spanish model, but the tercio remained the most well-known. A professional and multinational force. In addition to being an infantry formation on the battlefield, the tercios were also what today we would refer to as a regiment. They stood out as professional soldiers in a continent that had increasingly relied on mercenaries. This reputation for professionalism was only occasionally marred, such as when Philip II raised a tercio of Catalan criminals to fight in Flanders. The tercios owed allegiance to the Spanish Habsburgs, but Spaniards were a minority in their ranks, generally only making up between 10% and 20% of the regiments. Foreigners from all over Europe made up the rest: Walloons, Burgundians, Germans, Italians, Portuguese, Irish, and other ethnicities made up the rest. As professional soldiers, they expected to get paid, and the Spanish tercios in the Low Countries frequently mutinied when wages were delayed. These mutinies generally resulted in orgies of violence where Spanish soldiers ran rampant, sacking entire towns and cities in events that are remembered as Spanish Fury. The hatred they inspired in the local population did much to undo their successes on the battlefield. The tercio constituted the tactical and organic unit par excellence of the armies of the Habsburg Spanish monarchy, with its origins in the army of the Catholic monarchs of Spain after the reforms of Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, the Great Captain, and officially organized in 1536 with the Ordinance of Genoa by Charles V. The Spanish tercios dominated the European battlefields for almost 150 years. Old and new tercios. In origin, 4 tercios were created: the so-called tercios viejos, permanent, and whose names referred to the territory they had to defend, although in 1567 they would be sent to the Low Countries to fight the Dutch rebellion. Also, at different times, other tercios were created, named after their maesters de campo. The selection of the officers, both the maesters de campo and the captains, were in charge of the Concilio de Guerra, which had to evaluate the candidates and choose the most suitable. Once they received their patents, they were assigned a recruitment area so that they and their ensigns enrolled any suitable volunteer who appeared. The 2 great novelties regarding the previous era derived from the growing needs to face multiplying fronts. These were the creation, by 1635, of nobler tercios or regiments and provincial tercios. The first, inspired by the model of the French army, were units whose recruitment and maintenance was carried out, at least in part, by prominent nobles or important members of the church. As a counterpart, where they reserved the right to appoint the officers. Theoretically, they had to be elite units with an important aristocratic element, and that gave occupation to the ubiquitous unemployed veterans who resided in Madrid in search of a position. But their quality was very variable due to the human element recruited. As for the provincial tercios, these were militia units recruited by the municipalities of the different peninsular kingdoms and that had to integrate a reserve army for the case of necessity. Their interventions, thus, were limited to the fronts of the Iberian Peninsula. Their performance in combat was unequal, since to form them resorted to forced enlistments. Organization of the Spanish tercios. During the 30 Years' War, organic flexibility was one of the basic characteristics of the armies of the Spanish monarchy. As it had been in the previous century, tercios were, above all, groups of a number of companies that could be attached or detached at all times. Unlike the French crown, which in the period 1610 to 1660 tended to group its veteran troops into units formed entirely by experienced soldiers, the Spanish monarchy favored the merge of experienced companies and companies of bisonos in the same tercio, which guaranteed a good average level in combat units. The flexibility of the Spanish military model went further, since the same tercio could fight at the same time in scenarios as different as Brazil and the Mediterranean. This happened when the unit was subdivided into two, one commanded by its Meister de Campo and another by his second-in-command, the Sergeant Major. This eventuality occurred in several cases during the 30 Years' War, when Spain had to fight in numerous fronts not only in Europe, but also in America and Asia. As for the internal organic, an important difference with respect to the previous years was the decrease in the number of troops per tercio, which fell to an average of between 1,000 and 1,500 men. In 1633, for example, the Army of Flanders had 3 Spanish infantry tercios with 3,760 troops in total divided into 51 companies. On average, by then tercios had between 15 and 20 companies each. Companies were administrative units, usually commanded by a captain and formed by soldiers of 3 types: pikemen, musketeers, and arquebusiers. Throughout the decades of the 30 Years' War and the resumption of the Flanders War, the proportion of firearms in the tercios was gradually increasing to assume 2/3 of the total at the end of the conflict. In 1636, for example, the Cardinal Infant Fernando, commander of the Army of Flanders, tried to ensure that all the companies had 69 pikemen and 120 musketeers. In certain units, the arquebuses were eliminated due of its smaller caliber compared to the musket, but this weapon continued being used during all the period. A problematic aspect for the Hacienda Real was the increase in the number of officers in each company, especially through the reformed officers without command, usually from dissolved units. Those were integrated into other companies as soldiers, but with the salary of an officer. Despite the cost, this increased the efficiency and combativeness of the troops, as evidenced by the tercio of Martin de Idiaquez in Nordlingen. Tactics of the Spanish tercios. In the tactical field, the basic formation continued to be the escuadron, although with perceptible changes throughout the period due to the increase of firearms and the desire by the High Command for greater flexibility. Thus, the tercio squadron with 2,000 troops, or more, who still starred in the battles of the first phase of the 30 Years' War, gave way in the 1630s to smaller units, with between 800 and 1,000 troops on average, which formed with between 10 and 5 ranks, in progressive decrease, and a wider front to accumulate firepower on the flanks of the block of pikes that constituted the core of the unit. The tercios mangas, formed by arquebusiers and musketeers from the different companies, had to maintain a sustained fire to wear down the enemy before the charge of the pikes. Experienced units were able to do so for several hours, at least if they had ammunition, as emphasized by the Marquis de Villada, Captain General of the Army of Lombardy, after the Battle of Pro. At the same time, especially in the complicated scenario of the Low Countries, where pitched battles were scarce in this period due to the profusion of canals, rivers, and fortresses, the mangas of shot continued to play a very important tactical role. These groups of musketeers and arquebusiers were detached from their squadrons to distract the enemy with a skirmish, usually barricaded behind hedges and groves, or they were deployed in vanguard earthworks for the same purpose. They could also perform, in conjunction with small cavalry forces, harassment actions such as ambushing dispersed enemy troops and attacks on supply convoys. If tercios adopted progressively more linear formations, the Spanish armies did the same when deployed on the battlefield. While echelon and deep deployments had been chosen until the end of the 1620s, since the 1630s and especially the 1640s, closed lines tended to form with successive formations, which used to unfold in 2 lines with a reserve, the infantry in the center and the cavalry, more and more numerous and with a more aggressive tactical role on both flanks. This tactical model evolved in parallel in the different European armies since the end of the 16th century with the reforms of Mauricio de Nassau. Spanish tercios were not an exception, and far from falling behind, quickly adapted to innovations of the period. The effect of the Swedish Brigade, an extremely complex tactical model that required great expertise and was abandoned after the death of Gustavo II Adolfo, was virtually none. In many of the main battles of the 1618 to 1648 period, Spanish tercios, as well as the tercios of the different nations that formed the Spanish monarchy, overwhelmed rival infantry, whether Dutch, French, German, or Swedish. Decline and fall. The tercios had a reputation for invincibility, but this did not always hold true in combat. The first famous instance of this was the Battle of Nieuport in 1600, where Maurice of Orange defeated a Spanish army in a pitched battle. Maurice had instituted a series of reforms that combined Spanish tercio tactics with that of the Roman legions. Even still, the Spanish tercios came close to victory. Rocroi is often seen as the swan song for the tercios, fought in 1643. It was a hard-fought battle between France and Spain, where a smaller French army outfought a larger Spanish force. The French defeated the Spanish cavalry before surrounding the tercio infantry on all sides. The tercios defeated 2 cavalry charges and endured hours of endless artillery bombardment. Most of the foreign infantry deserted and fled, but the Spanish soldiers remained on the battlefield, fighting off all comers. Nonetheless, Rocroi shattered the myth of Spanish tercio invincibility forever. The 17th century would see the use of firearms surpass melee weapons. The age of the tercio was over.